Recently, I'm going to ask you to analyze a couple of things. I'm not sure if you feel comfortable doing so, and please let me know if you don't. But Amber Heard was in the public recently with Johnny Depp, and I really feel like they did a public service because they showed how messy psychopathology is, that there's not a good person and a bad person necessarily. There's a lot of just shit going down. He was a severe alcoholic, and who knows what he did in his blackouts, and what his alcoholism had him thinking about and doing. And she was formally diagnosed borderline and histrionic mixed disorder, which creates tons of distortions and acting out behaviors. And how did you see all that?
So, very good question. I have made a few videos on my channel about this, particularly critiquing the expert witnesses in their trials, because that's very similar to what I do. So here are my broad thoughts. I think that neither of them came out particularly well, but I think that we saw Johnny Depp as somebody who's quite vulnerable, who is quite insightful, and who was willing to own up to at least some of his behavior. He admitted that there was something broken about him so far. And he at least on the surface indicated that he wanted to change. Amber Heard, however, didn't come across that well at all. In fact, I think the public tide of opinion changed on her. So initially, people were quite supportive. And going back to the diagnoses you mentioned, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about experts diagnosing somebody for the purposes of a defamation trial. But I have to say that a lot of her activities and behavior are very typical for those diagnoses. So as you will know, people with borderline personality disorder tend to have quite explosive relationships. They tend to have unstable moods. They tend to have turbulent relationships. They can be quite impulsive, quite aggressive. And then you get people with histrionic personality disorder who don't take criticism very well. They need to be the center of attention. And Amber Heard does at least seem to be many of those things. And one big aspect of borderline personality disorder is this fear of being abandoned, which would explain why they stayed in this sort of toxic relationship for such a long period of time. So I have to say that I think these diagnoses are quite accurate.
They can't tolerate the borderlines can't tolerate the breaking and forming of relationships. And to be fair, if I understand it right, they did formal neuropsychiatric testing on her, right? I mean, she actually submitted herself to actual testing, so there was objective data that the psychiatrist was relying on. Now, maybe you ought to speak to that. How reliable is the various personality profiles and neurological testing that's out there? And my big question would be, how much does it change over time and setting?
Sure. So I think there's inherently a bit of a gray area if you look at the setting of when somebody's making this diagnosis. So in real life, in patients that I will see, that you will see, generally speaking, people are going to be open, they're going to be honest, because when they're seeing a clinician, they're doing it because they have a problem that they want to solve and they want an accurate diagnosis. I think when you're doing it in this kind of slightly circus show, when you're both celebrities and there's tens of millions of dollars of money that can be attributed to either side, then obviously there's an inherent bias about the way somebody might come across. So if you're Amber Heard, you might want to exaggerate some of your symptoms, particularly the symptoms related to trauma. Or if you're Johnny Depp's legal team, you might want to really elicit the fact that she's got all these personality disorders to make her look more unstable. So already there's an inherent bias, in my opinion. And as to the neuropsychological testing, I mean, it's generally quite accurate, but it all depends on how truthful the individual is being. So again, if there's an agenda for the individual to come out a certain way, then any test, I think, any psychological psychiatric test can be bent to come out with a certain outcome.
But most of the more comprehensive tests, though, include evidence of adulteration, right? I mean, at least you can say the reliability is X.
Yes, you're right. They have the reliability factors. There's, truthfulness axes inbuilt in them. But if you're clever enough, and if you're a very talented actor or actress, I believe that you can certainly sway them in a certain direction.
That's interesting. Now, so I actually work pretty well with borderlines. I had to deal with a lot of them, obviously on a drug unit. It's a very common diagnosis, or at least people behaving as though they had that disorder. Sometimes it all goes away when their drug addiction settles. But the really frustrating symptom that I found, and I've tried to speak to it to help people understand it, and Amber Heard exemplified this a bit, was their distortions. That I did not find that they lied. I found that they typically just experienced something totally different than what happened. That's why, and you'll appreciate. I'm sure you always bring somebody in the room with you, particularly with borderlines, because you walk out and had a nice exchange, and the patient goes, "He was abusive to me. He yelled at me. He tried to touch me in inappropriate ways." And you're like, "What? Where? That is not what you get." I remember I used to get it sort of. Like righteous indignation, like, "Oh, what? How dare they?" And then I was like, oh, I get it. This is the disorder. So I just sort of expect it now. How do people sort of, and no one out in the real world sort of understands that's going down. They consider it lying, and then you put memory on top of it. And of course, memory is a very imperfect mechanism in our brain, so things get further distorted by memory. How would you coach people up to understand when they're around that and what to do with it?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that, as you indicated yourself, borderlines are very emotional. So they see everything through this emotional lens. I mean, I think everybody does to a degree, regardless of whether they've got a personality disorder, but it's ramped up for people with borderline. So if they're in a good mood, if they're angry, if they're annoyed, maybe even annoyed at somebody else, not the clinician in front of them in the room, they will act out on this. And the other thing that you mentioned is splitting. So borderline people often either absolutely love somebody or they absolutely hate them. So they denigrate when they're in a bad mood.
Or they go back and forth.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or they idolize if they're in a good mood. And as you say, they go back and forth. So I think the first key is understanding that. So you understand the way that they're presenting today is not necessarily how they'll feel tomorrow. And it's not necessarily their core beliefs. It's just that them reacting emotionally. But I have to say, within my cohort of patients, so people that have committed serious offences, people with borderline generally are not criminalistic. So they don't intend to be violent or to be offenders. They just cannot contain their emotions at the time.
That's their aggression. Yeah, they can't contain their aggression at a certain time, and feel sort of weirdly justified in doing something outrageous sometimes because some people characterize borderline as unregulated hostility. If that hostility takes over, they can do stuff.
Absolutely. So I see people with antisocial or dissocial personality disorder far more in my patient cohort, and they intentionally offend. You know, they're lifelong offenders, and they don't really regret their actions. They regret that they got caught, but they don't regret their actions. Whereas people with borderline, they lose their temper, they flare up, and then either immediately or days later, they're actually very remorseful and very introspective. But of course, the cycle keeps happening.
Right. I have this distinct feeling that the American society, the general character of the American psyche has become much more borderline or histrionic in the last 5 years in particular. I just, all the sort of weird histrionic delusionality, wildness that goes on social media. I wonder if social media had some role in inciting all this, but you know, and I noticed back in the day, the borderlines, I've said this before, always came into the hospital with at least 20 lawsuits under their belt. That was in the 80s and 90s. And the attorneys in this country caught on to what they were doing and developed a bunch of safeguards so that their frivolous lawsuits were not so commonplace. But I feel like the acting out now has moved into the social media sphere.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to be offended on Twitter or on other social platforms. And you see these people, I'd probably say that they're more narcissistic than they are borderline, but they just love the attention. They love being, you know, offended on behalf of a group of people. And Twitter's just the perfect platform. You know, you say that something bad has happened to you or that you've experienced some sort of bias from somebody in society, then everybody jumps in and pats you on the back and, you know, says, poor you. And then you gain popularity, you gain a following. So you can understand why people do that.